Good morning and welcome to the 25th meeting of the Constitution, Europe, External Affairs and Culture Committee in 2024. Our first agenda item is a decision on taking business in private. Are members content to take item 4 in private? Thank you. Our second agenda item is to continue to take evidence on the second phase of an inquiry in relation to the review of the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, focused this second part on mobility and trade in services. We are joined remotely this morning pardon me, by all of our witnesses. Professor Catherine Barnard, Professor of European and Employment Law at the University of Cambridge, Professor Sarah Hall, Deputy Director, UK in a Changing Europe, Mike Buckley, Director, Independent Commission on UK-EU Relations, and Professor Jonathan Portas, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's College London. And we welcome you all this morning, and I appreciate that both Professor Barnard and Mr Buckley have got a short time with us, so we'll try to be succinct. It's always a good thing, because maybe succinct answers would help with that too. So if I could open with a first question. In the recent Mansion House speech, the Governor of the Bank of England said the changing trade relationship with the EU has weighed on the level of potential supply. The impact on trade seems to be more in goods than in services. And guidance from the European Commission has suggested the TCA provides a significant level of openness for trade in services and investment in many sectors, including professional and business services. And I would just like to ask what your assessment of the impact on the TCA has had on services from a UK perspective. And can I start with Professor Barnard, please?
Thank you very much indeed for this kind invitation to be here. I will leave it to Jonathan to give you the economics. I'm a lawyer. But I would like to just start by observing that, in fact, the provisions in the TCA on mobility of people, which of course is crucial for the provision of services, if it was contact, are in fact incredibly limited. Now, of course, in fact, what's happening a lot is that where services are, they can be provided online, and this avoids a lot of the limitations in the TCA. If I want to go and work in France, for example, working in a university, and I want to be paid there, the TCA will not help me. I will have to get a work permit under French law, and that will much depend on the vagaries of French law, including whether they have a test which is me to show, or requires a university to show, that they can't get a suitable European to do the job. And so, yes, if you want to go short-term, there is a provision for short-term business visitors. But the crucial thing is you can't be paid. And there are key sectors which are excluded from the list of short-term business visitors. And as you're going to come back to this, touring musicians, artists are all good examples of those who are excluded from that category of people who can benefit from the protection in the TCA.
Can I bring in Professor Hall, please?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. So I think the OBR recently stated that it concluded that the data it has seen on Brexit is broadly in line with their initial assumptions, that Brexit would reduce the UK's trade intensity, so a measure of how much the UK is trading, by around 15% in the long term, and it's arguing that it hasn't seen data to change that. I think what's interesting is that on the surface, at least, services exports to the EU have held up rather better than we might have expected, and the hit has been particularly in goods. And that being said, my own interests are in financial services, and that sector, which is strategically, politically and economically really central to the UK economy, that sector does not enjoy anything like the same amount of market access that it did when the UK was a member state. So I think when you're assessing the TCA, it's really important to think that your baseline is the UK was a member state. It's different to comparing the relationship between, say, Singapore and the EU. And I think that's where some of the confusion arises around what the impacts have been.
Thank you. Mr. Buckley?
I'm conscious that I don't want to repeat things that have already been said. In terms of goods and services, I mean, I'm sure you're aware that services makes up the bulk of our economy. So we're, I think, at 72.8% of GDP. So goods is, of course, very important, and there are much greater barriers in place for goods than there are for services. But when it comes to overall impact on the UK economy, services is an incredibly important part. It is very good news that services trade has held up, but I think we need to not compare to the past. We also need to compare to a future that we might have had. And it is certainly the case that services trade with the EU would have grown much more greater than it has, had we remained a member of the member of the EU and a member of the single market. Obviously, Professor Hall has referred to financial services. And with financial services and transport, I think it's important to recognise that, and other sectors as well, the EU doesn't, and the single market isn't fully integrated in all aspects of services. So there are regulations in place in different member states which can create barriers even between member states, but they are progressively working to reduce those. Of course, those barriers are not being reduced when it comes to the UK because we're not part of that anymore. But certainly with financial services and transport, those two sectors in particular are quite well integrated in the single market. The UK used to be part of that, we're not anymore. And because those two sectors, probably particularly financial services, are seen as important to the EU economy, they have quite strict barriers for outsiders, and we are now outsiders. And indeed, the EU and the member states look at the City of London as a major financial services centre and therefore see it as a rival, and therefore essentially want to keep the City of London out. And so devised the TCA to enable that, which of course has made things difficult for the City of London. And you, like me, no doubt would have read articles and news pieces saying the City of London's doing very well, it hasn't lost many jobs. In reality, though, what is happening is that growth that would have happened is now not happening in the City of London. And jobs that would have been created in the City of London are being created in Amsterdam or in Paris or in Frankfurt instead. So there has been a major hit to that sector. It just isn't really being talked about. And I think also importantly and understandably, the big institutions in the City of London aren't really talking about that hit publicly either, because, of course, they want to talk up their sector and its survival and the fact that it's thriving and so on. And they don't really want to point to the negatives and the downsides. And from a Commons perspective, I fully understand that. But unless you as legislators recognise that and understand it doesn't necessarily need to go on the front pages, but governments ought to respond, because we should be doing all we can to help that sector because it is so central to our GDP.
Thank you. And finally, Professor Portas, please.
I will just, I think, echo what Catherine and Sarah have said. There clearly are some additional barriers to services trade as a consequence of Brexit and the operation of the TCA. But the fact is that the UK's overall, in macroeconomic terms, the UK's overall performance on services exports has been good. It is broadly in line with the pre-pandemic trend. It's very difficult to see any obvious Brexit effects. I'm sure that at the sort of micro level, there are indeed some jobs and some services that are now located on the continent rather than in London and other financial centres here. But it hasn't really moved the dial. And I think the big picture looking forward is that the UK has a lot of economic problems. The UK and Scotland have a lot of really big structural economic problems around the things we all know about: productivity, investment, demography. We have one really big advantage, which is that we clearly have a very significant comparative advantage in tradable services. And that has survived Brexit considerably better than I or other economists, I think, would have expected. And looking forward, the question is really, given all our other problems, we really need absolutely to make the most of this. So without making any sort of specific policy recommendations at this stage, it's a good news story. Brexit has not been the disaster for this general sector that we might have thought. But going forward, it is our big advantage. We need to make the most of it on issues relating to the TCA, but much more broadly as well.
Thank you. This is going to be a bit tricky to manage with everyone being online, so I'm going to go to questions from members. If they could direct where they want to direct questions, and if anyone wants to add anything to that, if they could put it in the chat, and the clerks will let me know that you want to come in. So I'm going to go firstly to Mr. Alexander.
Good morning. Thank you very much. You've all touched on the challenges that we faced and we continue to face in managing the processes and sectors that we have. And Professor Porges, you've just touched on there about potential successes that we've seen and how things have progressed. But are there specific areas and are there specific sectors where there has been a real change in that it has gone from vibrant to non-existent, and are there others where they have gone from a level that was acceptable to now progressing and actually seeing some opportunities that have come through? Because we have heard that organisations have relocated offices to other locations to try and develop and expand some of the processes to ensure that they can tap into. But at the same time, there's others who've not done that at all and have found it to be reasonably successful. So do you believe that there is an opportunity to try and do that and move that forward? And if I maybe ask Professor Portes that first, about where he sees that, and then maybe move on to Professor Barnard.
Well, I mean, I think the big success story and the big opportunities have been, and it's very unfortunate the data, as you will know, I suspect, the data for the UK on services trade is both considerably less timely than for goods trade. And I think, we do not know exactly, but I suspect that I and others are strongly of the view that it's also significantly more inaccurate because it's very hard to measure some of this trade that quote trade, unquote, that happens remotely. But within what we know, I think we know that the general category of other business services, that's to say legal, consultancy, accounting, all these things, both particularly around things like consultancy broadly defined, where there are relatively few trade barriers of any sort, that those have been doing extremely well. And I think, we can see why from this morning's hearing, right? I regularly do this sort of thing remotely, including to people in foreign countries and including for money, and that is an export. And that really did not happen, certainly not in the same way 5 or 10 years ago. So that is the opportunity, and that should, if we look at Scotland's relative competitive advantage within the UK, there may be some advantages to Scotland specifically from that. And I think in terms of sort of trade promotion, it is looking at where those sort of comparative advantages. You have a lot of space, a lot of very beautiful countryside. It's easier in some ways for you to allow people both to live near large cities and within reach of countryside than it is for some of us down here in the crowded greater southeast. So there are potential competitive advantages, I think, there in these growth sectors, and it's there, I think, that I would be looking for opportunities and to see what is needed to break down to reduce the barriers to entry, which I suspect are not so much specifically around trade arrangements, but around things like both immigration policy, as we know, mobility, the way that the universities, the place of universities within the business ecosystem, and so on.
Thank you.
Mr. Bibby's got a quick supplementary, and then I'll bring in Professor Barnard. Thanks.
Yeah, it was just to follow up on the points that were just raised there about trade and services holding up better than trade and goods when they're largely excluded from the TCA. And can I just ask what analysis there is on that? And also, we've heard this morning about online remote working being a big factor of that. Does that, is that enough to largely explain what's happened, or are there other factors as well? Professor Portas and perhaps Professor Hall. Sorry.
There's quite a lot of analysis, but as I said, it's slightly hampered by the fact that the data is far from ideal in this, even at a UK level, and let alone at a country level. But the Resolution Foundation, for example, has produced some excellent analysis. The ONS, of course, does analysis of this for the whole country, and then on sort of more specific, detailed, disaggregated level, our colleagues June Du at Aston Business School has done some work on trade and services, and of course Sarah has written on this too. Yep. So there is some analysis there, and I think it all, as I say, broadly supports the picture of the UK's relatively good performance in this, but it is a frustratingly moving target because of the nature of the data. In terms of how much of this is account for remote working, I certainly think that it is very hard to imagine that you would see this growth in this sort of general catch-all category of other business services without the use of remote working. I just think it's inconceivable that you would have had that, both because it is just such an integral part of the business process, whether in terms of the necessary coordination between teams across different countries and locations, and in the direct interaction with clients. So much of it happens remotely now in a way which it doesn't. That you would, I think, simply see a lot more activity simply taking place in the individual country or city offices of individual firms, whereas now it's much more across different locations. So I personally am not completely convinced, but again, in terms of quantitative analysis, we don't have very much.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Portas. Can I ask Professor Hall the same question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just struggling with my muting. I think that the key thing, I totally agree on what's been said on other business services. And I think it's actually really important to set out that I think that this is an area where future research is needed. It's an incredibly broad category as set out in the Office for National Statistics. And there are some activities that the data clearly shows Scotland does very well on. So I'm thinking here around fintech. At the intersection between financial services, technology and consultancy that don't fit neatly in the Office for National Statistics categorisations. When those business codes were set up by the ONS, something like fintech didn't exist as an activity. So accurately knowing how these new and emerging activities are playing into our economy, I think is still an area of uncertainty. I think the other important point to make is that in many ways we shouldn't be surprised that other business services are doing well when we think about how they are traded and what the barriers to trade are. So the barriers to trade in services are not tariffs. They're essentially about regulatory alignment between the two trading parties. And in many ways, that regulation is sensible and important. I think we'd all agree that we would want to be certain about a medic's qualifications before they operate in our country. There's a really good rationale for that. But that means that services like consultancy that have much lower regulatory standards, I could set up as a consultant with no professional qualification if I had the capital to do that. And that makes it much easier as a consultant to sell their services into another country. It's not like being an architect where you have a professional qualification that you need to deliver. So I think I have a degree of caution around the data, particularly because a lot of this other business services activity is new and doesn't fit neatly in our existing data. And I think the other explanatory variable that's really important is that these are services that have quite low barriers to trade in terms of services trade because they're not reliant such kind of regulatory closure around who can operate as an IT consultant, for example.
Thank you.
Thank you. Alexander, you had asked
Professor Barnard if she's able to.
Original question, yeah.
Initial question, thank you.
Thank you for that. Can I answer the first part, which is what sectors have been badly affected? So I'm looking at the negative rather than the positive. Now, the sector we know, or the sectors we know that have been particularly badly affected in the creative industries, so musicians, artists, models, any like that. And if I may just very briefly give you a bit of law to help you understand why they've been so badly affected. The first thing to understand is that the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, is not EU law minus. It's actually WTO law with a tiny bit plus. In other words, it would be totally wrong to look at the TCA as some sort of substandard version of free movement of services. And therefore, the reason why this is relevant is because there are categories of individuals who are allowed to move. And the three categories which are most relevant for the purposes of that group of creative professionals are short-term business visitors, contractual service suppliers, and independent professionals. Now, just giving you those three titles, you might think, well, it's quite obvious that creative professionals would probably fall into one of those. The problem is that the way the TCA operates, it operates based on what's called a positive listing system. And a positive listing system means that only if your activity, your profession, your sector is listed in one of the annexes to the TCA, can you enjoy the rights under those three headings: short-term business visitors, contractual service suppliers, or independent professionals. And the problem is none of those in the creative industries are listed in those annexes. So what you find in those annexes is consultants can physically move, academics can physically move, but they can't be paid for their work if they go as a short-term visitor. And of course, the big difference between the creative industries and those providing other business services that we've been talking about is that the creative industries requires physical presence. I mean, if you're going to perform in the opera in Paris, you can't do it online, and you want to be physically there as part of the orchestra. And therefore, you actually have to move physically, and therefore, that would imprint the provisions in the TCA. But as I've just explained, the TCA does not cover any of the creative industries because of this system of listing. And so it's those who want to move to do jobs which require you to be there in person, they're the ones who've been particularly badly affected.
Thank you.
Okay, can I bring in Mr. Brown, please?
Thank you, and good morning. I suppose I'm just a wee bit stunned about the diversity in the responses. We go from the OBR being quoted as saying there's a 15% drop in trading intensity over the long term, which is absolutely astonishing if you think about it, the impact on the economy, to a statement that Brexit hasn't really moved the dial. I suppose I find it hard to reconcile those two different views. But in relation specifically to what we used to agonise over being the balance of payments, and I appreciate this is perhaps not information that may be readily to hand for the panel, the comparison between the balance of payments, which for the UK has been massively negative over a long period of time, and where Scotland's balance of payments, I suppose notionally, has been positive, exports exceeding imports over a long period of time. Are any members of the panel aware of how that may have changed during Brexit? I would imagine, for example, that if there's any data on Northern Ireland, that would have seen an improvement given their special status, but I'm just guessing. So I can perhaps come to Professor Hall first and then to Mr. Buckley.
Yeah, thank you. I don't have balance of payments figures readily available, but I do think, and I think there is there are indications that the impacts have been different across the UK. I think I would refer you to Professor Portes's earlier remarks about the challenge of data, and particularly the challenge of data disaggregation within the United Kingdom. For example, so you kind of end up as a researcher in my field almost using workarounds to try and understand exactly what's going on. But when I think about financial services, which is the sector I'm most familiar with here, I think there's clear evidence that London has held up more than anticipated, more than was projected at the start of the process. But I think sometimes the focus on what's been going on in London maybe masks some other quite important trends, and particularly the ways in which mid-tier financial centres in the UK have perhaps taken more of a hit than we readily acknowledge. And there's quite clear evidence of significant growth in places like Warsaw and Lisbon in terms of mid and back office functions. And I think that's something that shouldn't be ignored, particularly in terms of thinking about the expertise that Scotland has in financial services, because what was the rationale for investing FDI into financial services in Birmingham or Belfast or Glasgow? A lot of it was that you were getting a highly skilled workforce, fluent in English, able to work in the English common law system, but also able to access the single market. And without single market access, some of those attributes in terms of a highly skilled workforce are available at a lower cost in other EU member states. So I think that's how I would kind of summarise the situation from the data I know.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Buckley?
So I'd say a few things. On the subject, or the question rather, of the difference between things like the OBR saying there's a 50% drop in trade intensity and other people saying, oh, things aren't so bad, they're much better than they would have been. I think that's partly looking at different data sources. I think it's partly people's different perspectives. So if you remember us leaving the single market and the customs union in the EU, there were lots of projections as to how bad the economic impact was going to be. And in the event, it often hasn't been as bad as people expected it would be. So as a result, you do have a cohort of people saying, oh, things aren't quite so bad as we thought they were going to be. In reality, though, what other people will compare to things as they could have been. So a counterfactual, had we stayed in the EU and the single market and the customs union, where would the UK economy now be? Where would trading goods and services now be? So if you look at it from that latter perspective, things are definitely, you therefore have a much more pessimistic view on where we are, whether it comes to trading goods or services, or indeed in sectors thriving. I think one other problem is the fact there's just lots of data that we don't have, as other people have referred to. So when you're looking at, say, industries like cars or automobiles or, big physical things that are constructed by, sold by, traded by big companies that gather data and then can communicate that data, there's lots of readily available data. But when you're looking, for example, at some of the newer industries like fintech, again, we referred to already, where there's just much less data gathering, but also particularly at SMEs. So if you're looking at SMEs, I've spoken to lots of people working in the SME sector, obviously across a whole range of different sectors, who have either stopped trading with the EU entirely or have just stopped trading at all because that was what they used to do, or they've shifted to doing different things. That data is not systematically gathered by anybody. So nobody really knows, other than anecdotal evidence, of what the impact has been. But often, because those smaller organisations don't have the capacity to employ lots of people to fill in forms if they're trading in goods, or to adjust to the fact that their mobility is reduced if they're trading in services, a lot of SMEs have just shifted to doing different things, but they've had nobody to tell that to because the government hasn't been interested in that information. Certainly the last government wasn't, and I'm not sure how interested the current government is either. On the subject of regional impacts, I think, again, a missing piece of data is the fact that before Brexit happened, there was research done into what the different regional impacts of Brexit would be. And if essentially the decision was made or the determination was made that areas like London, for example, and the high-performing areas of the UK wouldn't be particularly badly affected, but poorer regions of the UK, the already poor regions of the UK, like Northern Ireland, like the North East, like poorer parts of Wales, like South Yorkshire, etc., would be much more badly impacted. You know, the difference being that people expected the impact in London would be a loss of, say, 1% of GDP. The loss in the North East would be something like 12% of GDP. We simply don't know if that has been borne out. I suspect it probably has been, but I'm not aware of anybody who's had the capacity or the choice to do that research. And certainly the last government wasn't interested in doing it. Whether this one will be, we don't know yet. But when you look at regional GDP figures, and there is some evidence on that, Northern Ireland has jumped from being bottom of the pile in every survey pre-Brexit to being consistently number 2 after London. So London's not doing too bad as far as we know. Northern Ireland obviously is in both markets for goods and is doing as a result better, and we can all celebrate that. But it sounds from the data that we have, like the rest of the UK, including Scotland, is doing worse. I would love to be in a position to do that research, but we as an organisation simply don't have the capacity. But I'm continually aware that it's a job that needs to be done. And of course, if it was borne out that already poorer regions of the UK were losing out, partly as a loss of structural adjustment funding, but also just because of a loss of economic activity, that would be really important. Another piece of work that needs to be done is consistent research or much more in-depth research with SMEs.
Thanks. Just before coming to Professor Porteous, just to say in response to what Mr Buckley just said, the vast majority of evidence that this committee has heard veers towards the disastrous effects. So people saying that they've stopped trading immediately, small seafood producers, for example, stopped trading immediately. Others have outsourced to other parts of the EU. Others have had to go through other parts of the EU in order to continue their business. However, and also the point about the lack of data. So certainly as a former economy secretary here in Scotland, trying to get information about Scotland from UK sources is very, very difficult. It's very often not disaggregated, and it's often based just on surveys. So I appreciate it's difficult, but the question I was really asking was about the balance of payments. And you'd mentioned it, Professor Porteous, just if you're able to say anything about what the balance of payments was before Brexit over the longer term and what it might be now. And I realise it might be difficult, but is there any way you can disaggregate that to different parts of the UK?
First of all, just to pick up the original question about the difference between the OBR assessment and mine, and I think that's easy. There is no difference. I agree with the OBR said that the long-run negative impact of Brexit would be 15% on trade intensity, and as a consequence, about 4% on GDP per capita. And they see no reason to change that long-run assessment, and neither do I. The point I was making is that if we look specifically at trade and that impact on trade has been felt on trade in goods. At a macro level, at least, it is hard to see that it has been felt in trade and services. And that was my point, that the negative effects that we've seen so far in macro level data are very much on trade in goods, and they're not really on trade in services, despite the points that other witnesses have made, which I do not dispute, about sort of individual impacts on particular businesses or particular small sectors. Overall, trade and services has continued to perform very well, despite Brexit. But I don't, as I said, the OBR's overall assessment of the impact of Brexit on the UK economy remains, I think, the sort of best guess that we can have, uncertainties notwithstanding. There is a negative impact on trade in goods, hence a negative impact on trade, hence a negative impact on GDP and productivity. In terms of the, it's obviously, I'm not entirely sure when you refer to Scotland's balance of payments, which is a very interesting question, whether you're referring to Scotland's, international trade, on which we have figures, of course, albeit out of date and subject to the same issues as those that are relevant to the rest of the UK, or Scotland's balance of payments in sort of the economic sense, that is to say, taking into account its imports and exports with the rest of the UK on the one hand and the rest of the world at the same time. My take here, unfortunately, is that particularly on the latter, where for obvious reasons it's very, very difficult with the best will in the world to get data, the latest data I think that is available is from 2021, which was still very much the bounce back from the pandemic, and it's not clear that you can read anything into that in long-term trends. And then, of course, as you will know better than I do, the value of Scotland's exports in the short term are quite volatile as a consequence of the impact of energy prices. So, of course, they went up a lot during the energy price spike, and then down a lot as that receded, and that's sort of quite sort of normal in the broad sweep of history, and not something that is directly attributable to Brexit. But my perception is that Scotland still has a balance of pay, does relatively well compared to the rest of the UK in terms of international trade overall, but it does have a significant deficit with the UK, with the rest of the UK. And that is, from a macroeconomic perspective, that's almost an inevitable counterpart of the fact that on net, and I know this is a hugely controversial topic in Scotland that I suspect we don't want to get into, but on net, that Scotland, that from a fiscal point of view, there are significant transfers from the rest of the UK to Scotland. And, as a macroeconomic fact, capital flows one way must be mirrored by a trade deficit the other way. So if Scotland is spending more than it's getting in tax, there's going to be a counterpart trade deficit to that within the UK.
Thanks. Just come to the last witness, the Professor. Just to say on that point, you said with the best will in the world, this information is not available. There is no will to look at the information on exactly the point you made. What are Scotland's exports? Because in relation to whisky and oil comes ashore, it gets sold in the Netherlands, it's apportioned to the UK. There's no clarity. There's a lot of clarity on fiscal transfers, but very little on what goes out of Scotland. But I wonder if we can just come to the last Professor, just to wind it up, if possible.
I think it was Catherine. I don't have anything to add to your question.
I just want to say on your point about goods versus services, and you specifically mentioned seafood manufacturers, seafood producers. You're absolutely right. What the data is showing about goods, obviously we're mainly talking about services, but what the data is showing about goods is that small and medium-sized enterprises have stopped exporting to the EU because the burdens associated with it in terms of paperwork, in terms of proving rules of origin, are so crippling that it's just not worth the effort. Some exporters still are exporting, and they are actually paying tariffs on those goods, even though they're not obliged to under the TCA, because it's easier to do that than it is to go through all of the paperwork necessary to prove rules of origin. And so what we are seeing is, while services may have held up in certain areas, goods has been significantly affected. And of course, that points to could we do some form of SPS agreement, veterinary agreement with the EU as part of the reset? Now, I suspect the EU will not even countenance discussing anything to do with that until after the 21st of January, after President Trump takes office, for the simple reason that they want to say which way the UK is going to go. I think in President Trump's interest to trend the UK much more closely into the US orbit, by offering a trade deal, tariffs, but on condition that we accept his terms in the field of agriculture, which will actually have the effect of making it more difficult to trade with the EU rather than less. There will be more checks, because at the moment we're broadly aligned. If we were to enter into any deal with the US on those terms, we would be increasingly de-aligning, which will further aggravate the problem with the Northern Ireland border.
Thank you.
Mr. Kerr?
Yeah, so just to try and get our arms around what we're talking about, because we are exclusively talking about services here. The UK currently is the third
biggest exporter to the European Union, 7.1% of the entire EU imports are from the UK. Can someone tell me, just as a matter of fact, what's the split of that 193 billion US dollars of trade that we do with the EU between services and goods? It's predominantly services, I presume. Can anyone cast any light on that? Professor Barnard, you're nodding your head. I'll come to you.
No, what we do know, I'm a lawyer, but given that 50% of outputs is services, that clearly would be dominated by services.
And has anyone got any more definitive split? No, no one. Yes, Mike.
I've got not necessarily the stats that you want, but I do have some stats in front of me, actually, which I can tell you, which is about our services exports, not necessarily directly to the EU. So financial services, I'm not sure what year this refers to. Let me see in a second. Anyway, the most recent figures I have, 61.3 billion in exports. This is financial services. Travel, 28.4 billion. Telecoms, 5.4 billion, and transport, 29.4 billion.
That's globally, yes, but not specifically to the EU.
That's globally, not specifically for the EU.
So it's hard to get. Sorry, yes, Professor Porteous, do you want to come in? Porteous, you're speaking, but we can't hear anything.
The muting is happening centrally, so it's being controlled from Edinburgh, not London. I think there's a slightly misleading picture, actually. Our exports to the EU are considerably more goods heavy rather than services heavy.
Right.
We a lot of our, so if you. It's quite interesting because this has come up in the context of the threat from Trump's tariff policy. Actually, we mostly export services to the UK, to the US, but we mostly export goods to the EU. So for 2023, we exported 138 billion of services to the EU, which is a lot, but we exported 243 outside the EU, whereas our goods exports were 153 to the EU and 162 outside the EU. In other words, of our exports, of our goods exports, almost half go to the EU, but of our services exports, only about very, very roughly a third go to the EU.
All right.
So services is sort of in at least as measured, and I keep on coming back to this slightly frustrating point, which I know is frustrating for you. Believe it me, it is for us as well. But as far as we can tell, our services are actually considerably more global, whereas our goods are more weighted to the EU.
So the balance is towards goods with the EU rather than services.
Yeah,
Mike's put his hand up, so I guess he might be about to shed some more light on this.
Yes, I'm unmuted. Great. I'm just looking at a document that we have. We're shortly to publish this report on services trade, actually. So this is a stat from Deloitte. So they did some research recently, an article titled "Why Has the UK Missed Out on a Trade Boom?" One of the stats in there just makes the point that non-EU services trade from the UK has grown more than EU services trade.
Yeah.
So it compares now to 2016. So in 2016, our services trade was relatively similar to the EU and to the rest of the world. So our services trade exports to the EU were 160 billion rather. Non-EU services trade were 150 billion. So there's only a 10 billion gap. So to both, we were exporting about the same. Since 2016, this has shifted. So we now export significantly more to the non-EU part of the world than to the EU. So the EU services exports have gone down slightly to 155 billion, down from 160. So it's only a small reduction, but non-EU exports have gone up to 185 billion. So that's a 35 billion increase. So Exports to the EU have gone down slightly in services. Exports to non-EU have gone up by about 35 billion.
What's your analysis of why that is? How much is that being driven by the issues we're discussing today, and how much of that is driven by market opportunities for UK service companies?
I think it'll be clearly it will be a combination of things. It'll be regulatory barriers. It will be movement. I mean, certainly when it comes to movement, we were talking about earlier on. The government talks about MRPQ, recognition of professional qualifications. Most business people I speak to say that would be a nice to have, but don't really expect to get it. Partly because it would take years to negotiate if it was going to happen. But what they do want is business mobility. They want to be able to go over there and get paid, and they want to be able to go over there and have conversations face to face with people, run training courses. They also want to be able to send staff on short-term assignments because they have staff with particular expertise, here, for example, or in an EU member state, and they want people to be able to go back and forth and not face barriers from doing so and not feel like they're breaking the law for doing so. But it will, of course, be as well a shift to people looking beyond the EU for opportunities, finding those opportunities and exploiting them, in part, precipitated by the fact that we've left the EU.
So is the conclusion to that it's easier for service-orientated businesses and individuals to trade, for example, in the United States than it is in the EU?
Well, it may be similarly easy or difficult. It may be more easy in some areas, in some sectors. I wouldn't know which off the top of my head, I'm afraid. But clearly, it's easier for a services exporter to adjust than a goods exporter. A goods exporter is limited by proximity to the place they're exporting to. It's obviously easier to send something cheaper and to get something over the channel than it is to send it to the States or Panama. But a services exporter can look further afield. And indeed, I would imagine one of the reasons that we do particularly well with the US is just we've got a shared language. Then it's easier to export to people with whom you can more easily communicate.
Yeah, and are there any statistics at all on what sectors we're talking about within the generic term services when it comes to the EU? Do we have any kind of breakdown of what are... I mean, financial services was mentioned specifically, but I haven't heard any of the others mentioned. We took some evidence from the legal sector last week. What are the other main sectors, and how would you apportion the split in terms of importance? Anyone that knows can answer. I'm not sure who would know that. Perhaps, Professor Portas.
I mean, as we discussed earlier, I think the biggest sector by far is other business services, which includes your legal sector as a subsector. But it is this whole umbrella term covering legal services, consultancy, accounting, advertising, architecture, and so on. Where, of course, there's it varies between things which are quite well regulated, as it were, or where regulation matters, like architecture, to things like consultancy, where, as Sarah rightly said, that my consultancy business took me £10 to set up. I registered Companies House, and I use and I have a laptop, and I do it in our spare room. That's it.
Yeah, Bob's your uncle.
There's no, I believe that I'm qualified to do what I do, and so do my clients, I think. But there's absolutely no regulation involved.
Let's stick on that line that you've just raised: mutual recognition of qualifications. That is an issue. So, which sectors of the sectors you've mentioned have suffered more because of the loss of mutual recognition of qualifications, or has it mattered at all? Because one of the things that was highlighted last week in our evidence from the legal profession was that qualifications in Scotland aren't even recognised in England, vice versa. So how much of an impact has this really had?
I think that is very much one for Catherine.
So just to say, on mutual recognition of qualifications, when we were in the EU, there was a directive. The broad principle of the directive was immensely simple, and the clue's in the title, mutual recognition, and it was meant to be straightforward. In fact, even when we're in the EU, the mutual recognition provisions didn't work terribly well, because there is a lot of vested interest in each state to ensure they'll get the jobs in the professions and not to be very open to others. The legal profession in Italy is a very good example of that. Leaving the EU, of course, we've lost access to that directive and the principles underpinning it, and also the enforcement mechanisms underpinning it. There is a provision in the TCA whereby it is possible to negotiate mutual recognition agreement. It's based on equivalent provision in the Canadian EIDA FTA. And there is only one sector where there has been an agreement between the EU and Canada, which is architecture. And that took, depending on how you count, it's probably up to about 7 years to negotiate, certainly a very large number of months to get to the agreement on that. What you are seeing a bit of is some bilateral arrangements where you might have, for example, Law Society in trying to enter into some form of agreement with their opposite numbers in, for example. But as you've already said, it doesn't go swimmingly, Edinburgh and London, when we actually share a common Supreme Court. So you can imagine it's going to go even less swimmingly when you're trying to get the Bulgarians to recognise British qualifications. And so mutual recognition of qualifications is probably the biggest stumbling block for professionals to work in.
Which sectors have been particularly negatively impacted?
Law.
Law is the biggest issue, right?
Yeah,
and
the legal sector, yeah, law, and I imagine also, although I haven't got the data on this, accountancy as well. All of the ones which are underpinned by a detailed approach of a national legal system.
Okay, and Professor Hall, you want to come in?
Yeah. Yes, I just wanted to follow up in that. I want to make 2 points. The first is that you need to think about the value of mutual recognition of professional qualifications alongside mobility agreements, because if you had MRPQ but only limited mobility, you're not exploiting the full economic value of MRPQ. Someone could be qualified to work as an architect in Germany, but they also need the mobility to actually deliver that service face to face. So I think this is an important area where the terms in which UK service providers trade with the EU now are more like a complex web of kind of interrelated policies and regulations. So if you're a service provider, you've got to think about what service you're providing, what's your sector, which member state are you providing it in, are you qualified to do it, and do you have the mobility to do it? So it's quite complicated. The second thing is, and I just wanted to follow up on the case of architecture, which is one of the sectors that is impacted because there's a professional qualification to practice as an architect. And Catherine's exactly right that the EU and the UK can try and agree an MRPQ following the Canadian deal. In fact, in October 2022, the European Commission did receive a joint recommendation from the Architects Council of Europe and the Architects Registration Board in the UK, which set out proposals for a mutual recognition of architecture qualifications. But the Commission turned that down, arguing that, and I quote, they were unbalanced and prejudicial to EU architects, because under the proposals, UK architects would have a level of recognition similar to that they enjoyed when the United Kingdom was a member state. So I think that points to the difficulty of translating an agreement that the EU has with Canada to an agreement that the EU might have with the UK because of the proximity of the UK to the EU.
And because of the politics.
Because of the UK's relative strength in services. You know, I think the really important point here is that the EU met a lot of its negotiating ambitions on its strategically strong goods sector. Arguably, the UK didn't meet as many of its negotiating objectives around the UK's strategic strengths in services. And so that's where some of the complexity lies.
Yeah, they would see it as a threat to the agreement itself if they began to accede to the sort of request that the architects have all agreed among themselves. I get that. I think I may have used up all my time, have I?
I think we've got a second session today, so okay. Yeah, indeed. I'm going to move to questions of Mr. Harvey.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to our witnesses. You may be aware that later in this inquiry we're going to have some sessions specifically on mobility, and in particular the committee has an interest in youth mobility. I'd like to ask, though, about the connection between that theme and the services, the trade and services that we've been discussing, because it has come up in a number of your answers. For me personally, people's freedom of movement and young people's opportunity to move can be justified in its own terms, in terms of the social benefit, the immediate benefit that people get from it. But should we also regard it as an economic investment for the future to ensure that we have a generation of people coming up in every walk of life and business who have personal connections with people in other European countries, particularly in the fields that they've studied, and who regard European countries as something more than a holiday destination? What is the impact of the loss of that, in particular youth mobility, not just on trade and services at the moment, but what do you expect to be the impact if we don't restore that opportunity for the upcoming generation in the longer term? And regardless of whether the UK and the EU agree improvements in this area, is there anything more that the Scottish Government should be doing to maximise the opportunities in the current context for young people in Scotland to experience that connection with European countries, and for young people in Europe to experience a connection with Scotland? I think Professor Barnard is waving a hand, so please come in.
Thank you for that. As you can imagine, working in a university, we strongly about having some sort of youth mobility scheme. We've already seen the impact of Brexit on numbers of applicants coming from Europe. The numbers have gone down significantly, and it's also become much harder for British universities who are teaching modern languages courses to be able to send on years abroad, not least because now they've got to go through a visa application process to study at, say, a Spanish university. The EU proposed a very ambitious youth mobility scheme in May of this year, which was very quickly rejected by the Conservatives and as quickly by Labour. Now, it was a very ambitious ask, including on universities, that the fees should be set at home fees rates, which of course is not an issue for Scotland in the same way as it is in England, but also no health service search, both of which seem to be unacceptable to the UK. We also know that Yvette Cooper has come out very publicly to say there will be no youth mobility deal. That said, it may be, if there is some sort of reset, some sort of deal which might be described as a cultural exchange might be a way forward. In terms of what are the benefits having access to European universities, of course, the loss of Erasmus has been keenly felt by British universities. The Turing programme has not been an adequate replacement for the loss of Erasmus. And even under the Conservative government, there was a recognition of the value of having young people in the UK staying after they've had their degrees, because the UK government did introduce the graduate visa. So you could stay in the UK after you'd done a degree in the UK for 2 years, and you could work, all of which fact that the Conservative government also recognised the value of having young people being able to study here and then use their skills to work. And then clearly if they got a long-term job, then they could then get a 5-year visa to stay and then eventually apply for citizenship.
Thank you. I think I saw the order of hands that I saw coming up was Mike Buckley and then Professor Hall and Professor Portas.
Thank you. I'm afraid I have to leave very shortly, but before I go, just wanted to talk a bit about youth mobility. And it strikes me there's just a huge disconnect here between the UK and the EU. And this goes back to the disconnect that's been there the whole way along, of the EU primarily, or the non-UK EU, seeing the EU fundamentally as a peace project, bringing nations together, preventing war in Europe, creating understanding, mutual understanding, etc. And so then, for them, of course, mobility and youth mobility in particular is is something that is, it's an emotional thing for them, which of course it isn't in the UK. The UK has pretty much always seen the EU, the single market, etc., as an economic issue, as does it make us richer or does it make us poorer? And for the moment, we've just made the assessment, well, it makes us poorer, but we don't care because of the politics and not wanting to go back into the Leave-Remain divide, and for the Labour Party not wanting to upset the red wall and give Nigel Farage away, and etc. And indeed, we see that in youth mobility, because the whole youth mobility issue came up because the previous government, the Conservative government, was running around Europe and talking to EU member states that it liked, particularly Germany and France, and trying to persuade them to do bilateral youth mobility deals. So while the Conservative Party will probably never admit that publicly, that's what was happening, which is what set the whole process off, because then the EU Commission decided this is our competence, not your competence. So that when they came out in March with their proposal, that was not really anything to do with the UK. They were simply saying to member states, you need to get back in line because this is our competence, not your competence, which is why they announced what they did back in March. Of course, that had the effect of, in the run-up to a UK general election, making the issue public, giving some red meat to the right-wing press, forcing really the Labour Party and the Conservative Party both to say they wouldn't go near it in the run-up to a general election, which of course made Labour state a position. Since the election, of course, the EU have put forward different proposals, somewhat reduced from the ones they put before. But the thing, and I've said this to people from the EU many times, is in terms of the way that this debate became a notable issue and a front-page issue in the UK is really unhelpful. Because in the UK, the most difficult thing in all of the whole Brexit debate has been mobility, has been freedom of movement, a perception of freedom of movement that was taking people's jobs, keeping people's wages down. Regardless of how true that is, that's the perception and the story that's been put forward by Nigel Farage and the right. And that story has never really been countered by people in the Labour Party or other people on the left in the UK, or certainly not strongly enough. So therefore, freedom of movement is the most difficult thing. And talking about youth mobility, even though, of course, it's completely different to freedom of movement, it sounds too similar to too many people. Maroš Šefčovič, very recently, when he was talking about it publicly in Brussels, started talking about it as a youth opportunity scheme rather than a youth mobility scheme, which is something I've advised multiple people to do in the EU, because even just using a word to describe it that isn't a long word that starts with the letter M is helpful. So if they can continue on that basis, that would be good. The other thing I've said to people in the EU is please stop talking about this as a standalone issue. Just talk about it as in the wider reset as part of a piece. Don't use the word mobility or movement. Talk about it as opportunities or an exchange program or something. You're then much more likely to get what you want. In terms of what Scotland can do, I don't know what freedom of manoeuvre you have to do anything, particularly when it comes to university education or exchange programs. There is, of course, the slight workaround for school trips, so where people can come in on their identity cards rather than their passports. Would it be possible for Scotland to do something similar for people who are not on school trips, for university age, even if it's only for a month or for for a term or something like that? I mean, I simply don't know, but that's something that you could investigate. In terms of long-term impact on services, trade and GDP, I think that's very hard to say. I was reading yesterday or this morning that we're losing somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 EU nationals from the UK, just because over time, people who were here are deciding they're going to go home or they're going to go somewhere else. And people are not being replaced, in part because it's just so much more expensive for someone from the EU to come to the UK than vice versa, because there are fewer barriers for somebody here wanting to go to the EU, for example, on a digital nomad visa or something similar, or indeed to study, whereas people coming here, they're obviously not allowed to bring family members or spouses, the NHS surcharge. So we deliberately make it very, very difficult in lots of ways people to come to the UK. So it's understandable that a European person looking at different options of where to go, say if they're Polish or Romanian or Portuguese or French or wherever, will think, I'll go to Germany or I'll go to Spain, because it's logistically so much easier than jumping through so many hoops to come to the UK. So there may be things the Scottish government could do to remove some of those barriers. I don't know. Apologies for having to leave, but thank you so much for the invitation to join today. It's been a pleasure to meet you all.
Many thanks. I wish we had time for a long exchange about the political points you've made, but we don't. So I'll just say thank you and move on to Professor Hall.
Yeah, I wanted to return to the part of the question that spoke about the longer term impacts of that, of youth mobility. as Mike said, it's really hard to measure that in sort of quantitative economic terms. But there is really clear evidence in the research literature that the UK developed quite a lot of soft power through having kind of a very open international, particularly higher education setting. So I've done some research that was trying to understand why Chinese banks arrived in London in the early 2000s. And one of the really common stories was that senior officials in those banks had been educated in the UK. They felt an affinity to the country. They felt they understood the political and regulatory norms. And that can sound a bit woolly, but actually when you think about what services are, a lot of it is about developing trust between clients and service providers. So we know that things like common backgrounds, shared educational backgrounds can be quite an important plank, both in terms of delivering the trust that is needed to deliver services, but also I think it's quite clear that the UK did develop and has developed quite a lot of soft power through a kind of quite internationalised, particularly kind of youth mobility, but higher education system.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And Professor Portas.
Thanks. So there's quite a lot here, so I'll try and be brief. But first of all, just to sort of zoom out on the overall impact of Brexit in particular on the labour market and Scottish population and economy. Most of us, my particular field is immigration much more than trade. And those of us in the field were pretty unanimous in predicting that there would be a negative economic impact of Brexit on the UK and certainly on Scotland from the loss of free movement and the resulting impact that had on migration and hence the labour force. And on this, in contrast to the sort of OBR macro picture, we were clearly wrong. If we look at what's happened to the Scottish workforce. This is from the most recent data from HMRC on the number of people on company payrolls. We can see that the number of EU nationals on Scottish, employed by Scottish, in Scotland, has fallen slightly from the pre-pandemic high, which was about 145,000, down to 135,000. So that's a fall of about 10,000. And that's clearly a Brexit impact. So Brexit has reduced the number of EU nationals working in Scotland. On the other hand, that has been far more than outweighed by a very large increase in the number of non-EU nationals, which has more than doubled from about 75 or 80,000 pre-pandemic to 160,000. So the liberalisation of the migration system, which has resulted in very large increases in immigration overall to the UK, has very much impacted Scotland and has really done quite a lot to sustain the Scottish workforce over the last 5 years. Whether you call this a Brexit impact is a political, sort of a semi-political question, but what we have seen is a very large increase in the number of non-EU nationals working in Scotland, which has clearly been beneficial for the Scottish economy and labour market. And the same impact has been seen in universities. Scottish universities got a record number of non-UK and in particular non-EU students last year, or in the last year for which we have figures. And that's, the loss of EU students has been more than compensated by the rise in non-EU students. And I think, so for me, actually, the sort of big strategic question is, how does Scotland make the most of this? How do you get these people to stay, to thrive, to prosper, and to progress in the labour market? How do you work with universities to make the maximum use of the graduate visa, make sure that people who come to Scottish universities, whether they're from the EU, whether they're from France or from India or China or from Bulgaria, all of these people, you want them, after they've graduated from Scottish universities, to stay in Scotland and work in Scotland and contribute to Scotland. So they don't have to, of course. You can graduate from a university in Dundee and go and work in Dunstable. You don't want them to do that. So I think working with universities to try and keep people who have come partly because of the availability of the graduate visa, to get them to stay on and contribute to Scotland would be my #1 priority in this area. On youth mobility, a little to add what others have said. It's not freedom of movement. It does, I think, have the beneficial long-term impacts that you and others have discussed. Apart from pressuring the UK government to not be so silly and about this issue, and because frankly the idea that it's not free movement and the public don't see it as free movement, actually this is a political mirage that this is some sort of big issue that people would be worried about. Apart from that, I think it is very much more, again, at the micro level, what schemes there are as they are expanded, trying to maximise the relative attractiveness of Scotland within the UK as a whole here. How do you get people to, what are the particular strengths and attractiveness of Scotland that you can use within the framework of a UK-wide immigration system, which you broadly have to take as given, to make the most of that for Scotland?
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Any further questions? I just wanted to say about the post-study work visa as it was. Of course, that was made in Scotland initially,
Indeed.
And we had the exception for that. Initially then taken on and rolled out across the UK and then withdrawn except for Cambridge and Oxford. So it's a difficult balance to see how these things, it's a bit more complicated to look at it, I think, from a Scottish perspective, in that we've been impacted slightly differently by that whole process. But interesting figures nonetheless. The question I wanted, and I'm glad it's both of you that are still with us, as it's probably most directly to you, and it's around this issue of data, because what we've heard is that a lot of financial services are going now through Irish companies within the EU, and so not Northern Ireland. And also that we heard from the culture sector and touring artists that many of them are now joining sort of Celtic type festivals through an Irish base. And that Scottish artists are losing out in that point of view. And what I want to get to the nub of, is there any way of capturing that economic impact, the benefit to Ireland now, or any way at all that we could expose or understand that data more broadly? I'll go to Professor Portas first.
I'm not sure I can help on this. I mean, I think that is something you would have to ask the Scottish Government statisticians as to what they could do, or what extra information or help they would need from the ONS here in London and Newport to make that feasible. It's obviously very difficult. Because ultimately you have to get these records from individual businesses, and that requires, so that you have to survey or require a bunch of people who are obviously mostly small businesses struggling to get by to fill in an extra bunch of forms, and understandably that's hard. So I think it is actually quite a difficult task, but I think you'd be probably best advised asking them what is available and what more could be done.
Okay, and Professor Hall, have you any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jonathan. I think, though, it's important to note that part of the story in financial services is that Dublin was a strong financial centre within the EU before Brexit, and also has English as its main language, and I think crucially has quite strong trading links with the US. And so I think throughout the conversation, I think it's important to note that the US has been doing very well in terms of financial services activity. So it may be that this isn't just a Brexit effect. And I think it's quite important to sort of locate the impact of the TCA within these broader kind of global trade trends. The data I am more familiar with is financial services FDI into Northern Ireland. And it's quite clear that that has increased, particularly from the US. And in areas at the crossover between fintech and insurance in particular, so like insurtech, it's often termed. So you can sort of piece together data which would suggest that Dublin has fared quite well compared to other international financial centres. But in terms of the actual specific data that you're asking for, I think it would be worth asking statisticians officially for that.
Okay, I think that has exhausted questions from the committee this morning. Can I thank you all and put on record my thanks also to Mr Buckley and Professor Barnard for the attendance. It's been very, very helpful. I'm going to suspend for 5 minutes while we have witnesses change over. Thank you. Warm welcome back. Our third agenda item is to take evidence on a series of reports regarding the Scottish Government's commitment to align with the European Union where appropriate. These reports include a draft of the Scottish Government's 2024 annual report to use and on the use of the keeping pace power within the UK withdrawal from the European Union Continuity Scotland Act 2021. This morning we are joined by Angus Robertson, MSP, Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, External Affairs and Culture, George McPherson, Head of EU Policy and Alignment at the Scottish Government, and Lorraine Walkinshaw from the Scottish Legal Directorate. And could I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you here today on the subject of European Union alignment and our latest reports to the Scottish Parliament. Scotland voted to remain in the European Union, and we continue to share the European Union's values and respect the high regulatory standards from which we previously benefited. Our EU alignment policy aims to act as a brake on regulatory divergence by aligning with the European Union where it is meaningful and possible for us to do so. As a result, standards set by the European Union will continue to influence many of the policy frameworks and initiatives that we are developing domestically. This achieves practical outcomes for the people of Scotland, seeking to align with key pieces of EU legislation, supports our businesses with the consistency, transparency and certainty that they need, and it reduces the burden posed by different sets of rules. As I said in my supporting letter of the 31st of October, I'd like to extend my thanks to Dr Whitten for the Parliament's EU Law Tracker report. The EU Law Tracker is providing valuable support, insight and reassurance that the approach that we've taken to monitoring and reporting on our delivery of EU alignment is the right one. Our reporting process is now maturing, and we've made further changes to support transparency as suggested by the committee, and I'd like to thank you for the collaborative approach that we are taking in this important area of work. The expansion of our annual reporting highlights the complexity of taking alignment decisions and the need for a proportionate approach, as not all EU law has direct relevance for Scotland. We hold strongly to the view that remaining aligned with the largest single market in the world is a correct policy. Scottish businesses overwhelmingly provided the same view to the committee in its recent inquiry into the implementation of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. The British Chamber of Commerce too has called for, and I quote, as much alignment as possible and to make EU regulations the default position for the UK. The previous UK government caused significant legislative and regulatory uncertainty in its pursuit of the retained EU Law Act and so-called Brexit benefits. Throughout, the Scottish Government consistently aimed to align its legislation with EU law where possible and meaningful to do so, from banning problematic single-use plastic items, improving the quality of drinking water, and considering improvements to wastewater treatment. I'm pleased that the current UK Government is looking to improve its relationship with the European Union on trade and other issues, and this is likely to require a degree of alignment with EU law. And I'm pleased that the current UK Government too has now expressed a desire to avoid divergence. This will bring further benefits to the Scottish people and businesses, and this confirms that our approach has been the right one for our people and our businesses all along, and I'll be encouraging the UK Government to think positively and creatively about this. Thank you very much, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, and thank you for acknowledging the commissioned EU tracker and the work of Dr Whitten, which has been very helpful to this committee and the parliamentary committees too. I wonder if I could ask about a recent trip to Brussels with the committee to present our TCA report, and as we approach the review of that, EU institutions that we spoke with were very happy to consider proposals for a UK veterinary agreement, but on the basis of full regulatory alignment in the areas covered by the agreement. So I just wondered what the Scottish Government's view was on how this might work, including the role of this Parliament in scrutinising the necessary legislation to comply with regulatory alignment and the full agreement.
Well, thank you very much, Convener, and I'm glad that you're visit to Brussels was so successful, and I think it underlines the importance of why we should have regular contact between the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government and European institutions, whether that's the Commission, whether that's the Parliament, and also having an ongoing dialogue with colleagues working at Scotland House, which is the eyes and ears of a range of Scottish institutions. I think the then Conservative government had tremendous foresight in establishing Scotland House in Brussels, and since then it has shown its worth. And it's an important part of our monitoring of developments in the European Union. To the specific question around what I'm now preferring to call an agriculture, food and drinks agreement, because I think when we talk about a veterinary agreement or an SPS agreement, I think it's a kind of jargon often heard in a European context, which is not particularly well understood. And having an agreement which relates to agriculture, to food and to drink is something that would have a profoundly positive impact for the Scottish economy, for our Scottish agricultural sector, and would also be of benefit to the rest of Great Britain and to European exporters as well. This isn't just the view of the Scottish Government, it's now the view of the UK Government. And I welcome the fact that the new UK Government, at least rhetorically, is in exactly the same place in terms of a reset of relations with the EU and securing, and I think it was a manifesto commitment, an agreement that would cover this area of agriculture, food and drink. If you haven't already read it, I'd like to draw committee members' interest to the publication of a document on this by the Scottish Government entitled Trading Arrangements with the European Union, the Case for a Comprehensive Veterinary and Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement after Brexit. And in that it has details about the case, why this should be so, including points around what's known as dynamic alignment, so that is maintaining standards with the European Union. This has been shared with colleagues in Brussels and the UK Government and is part of ongoing conversations with UK colleagues. We have a forthcoming interministerial group which we will take part in with UK and of other devolved administrations, where this will form part of the conversation. There is an ongoing dialogue between the UK Government and the European Commission in relation to this and other areas where a reset might be meaningful. So I think that this has been a matter of discussion in the Chamber. I know the opportunities of rejoining Erasmus+, of Creative Europe, of a mobility agreement, especially for younger people in a European context. But this potential agreement, which would impact so much on agriculture, food and drink, is one that we will be raising again. And I know that is a subject between the relevant UK Minister and Maros Sefcovic, who is the relevant Commissioner who is dealing with these matters. And I believe I'm right in saying that there is to be a summit meeting to discuss this in April next year. So we have an interministerial group with the UK Government, I believe in early December, so shortly. So that will happen in advance of this meeting between the UK Government and the European Union, and we will take that opportunity to underline our support for such an agreement.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move to questions. So I've got Mr Stewart first.
Thank you. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. In your letter and also your opening statement, you talk about the proportionate approach that we're managing or trying to look at, and not being complacent in the guarding against any risks for the future. But keeping that record and shared information is vitally important, and our tracker has identified some of that. So it would be quite good to ask you what you see are the risks and expand on some of the risks that we now see ourselves in presently in comparison to what we thought might be the case when we started this process?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr Stewart. And if I can take the opportunity to formally welcome Stephen Kerr and Patrick Harvey onto the committee. Other members will have heard me say previously that because of my membership of the European Scrutiny Committee of the House of Commons for the best part of a decade, I genuinely understand why it's important that relevant committees have access to the information to be able to perform one's scrutiny function. And since the beginning of the conversation that I've had with this committee, I have said repeatedly, and say so again today, that I am extremely keen that my officials work with the committee clerks to make sure that we have the appropriate reporting mechanism in place that allows you to do your job and gives me the assurance that we are reporting in the most appropriate way, in the way in which you would wish, but is also proportionate in terms of officials' time. And I think I'm right in saying that I think we're probably in a good place in getting that balance right. So that's one aspect of things being proportionate. I think the other thing is understanding the mechanism by which an assessment can be made of the relevance of any particular legislative or broader policy proposal emanating from the European Union. So we have a series of steps and stages within government to work out exactly that. So in Brussels, in Scotland House, we have our own tracking mechanisms to see what is emanating from European institutions to work out, does that have an impact on Scottish legislation, the Scottish economy, and so on. Then there is a degree of validation of that early reporting in Scotland within the Scottish Government. Then, and maybe we'll have an opportunity to come back to this point, Convener, because I think it's quite important, because then individual cases are then shared with the different parts of the Scottish Government that have responsibility for policy areas. Then there's a next stage which involves is understanding the impacts of such changes, impact that might have on the Internal Market Act, perhaps international obligations, trade and cooperation agreement constraints. Then there is an assessment on these particular proposals, which are published, and recommendations are made to ministers on the alignment issues, whether that is direct legislative alignment or whether that is a broader policy alignment and the potential outcomes. So, what are the risks in all of that, Mrs. Stewart? I'm reading your mind. The first thing to say is this is still relatively new, this whole process. So I think having an open mind is really important to understand, is it working as well as we would wish it to and you would wish it to? And I think a balance has been struck. I think as we see the ebb and flow of how much emanates from decision-making bodies in the European Union. As you have been given evidence by Dr. Whitten, I mean, if there is a risk in relation to alignment, it is seen as being most likely around legislation at a UK or a Scottish level, which would then lead to a change in things. And I don't think that there's any tremendous evidence of that taking place yet. Is there a risk that that might happen? Of course. But I think given the position both of the Scottish Government and now the UK Government to try and remain aligned, I think that risk is reducing. It's been put to me in conversation with officials that there's a definite sense in Whitehall that there is a brake being applied to any potential risk of divergence. And that can be seen very clearly in one current example, which relates to the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill. But that's something that I will certainly be taking a closer look at as a Scottish Government Minister, and perhaps you might too as a committee too, because this impacts on devolved areas of responsibility. So there's perhaps also another risk if Scottish interests, as expressed by the Government or the Parliament more generally, are listened to or not. I hope they will be. And we are working very proactively with officials dealing with their colleagues in the UK government to make sure what those might be. But that's an emerging example of where there is a proposal. It's a UK legislative proposal. May that have an impact on alignment? Yes, it might. And are we part of a process? We are trying to be a part of a process to make sure that there is no disbenefit. And this surely must be about more than risk. It should be about opportunity, should it not? And I would hope that we all want the best form of regulation. I know that one person's red tape is another person's safeguard. I understand that. And there's a balance to be struck in this. But I think there is an opportunity of maintaining high standards, maintaining our democratic interests, both as a government and as a parliament, and making sure that this new process works for us and through our democratic institutions as well as possible.
And I think you identify the opportunities that may arise from some of this, and undoubtedly there are a number of opportunities that may arise. And if there is to be any conflict in the future, depending on where the risks are, and if there is a bit of divergence or there is a potential, once again, we've heard in the past about grabbing power, doing things in a situation which is confrontational. And I think that's where the potential problem could still arise, if there was that difficulty. And as you say, the amount of red tape that's required and the bureaucracy that's in amongst that. But do you see, as we look forward to improving, you've identified that you believe that the new government may be more aligned than previous. But what would be your view on progress as we see it in the next 12 months, a year, or whatever?
In fairness to the new government, it is a new government, so that's the first thing to say about the UK level of governance. I think we also need to be aware that the new European Commission was only approved yesterday. I think I'm right in saying, as in its membership, so that hasn't even got onto their legislative programme going forward. So because of the European Parliament elections and then a new Commission, there hasn't been a lot emanating from Brussels. So I think my answer to Mr Stewart is that proposals will be made, and we will deal with them at face value, and we will work with colleagues at a UK government and a European level as well as we can to make sure that we're pursuing our avowed aims of remaining aligned with the European Union. We are making sure that this is understood right across government. I'm talking about the Scottish Government here. I think there has always historically been a risk in relation to things European, that it's seen as something that needs to be done by the people who do Europe, whether it's this committee or previously the European Scrutiny Committee at Westminster, or a Europe Minister or a Minister for External Affairs, whereas in fact, when talking about different policy proposals within government, we are committed as a government to making sure that individual cabinet secretaries who have responsibility for different areas, that might be for agriculture and fisheries, that might be for justice, that might be for the environment, these would be through the areas where there is a very particular European locus to proposals, that my colleagues understand why this is relevant right across government, and that's why we have been holding interministerial groups, and I've been holding bilateral meetings with my colleagues in the Scottish Government to explain all of this. It's for Parliament, of course, to make a decision about the extent to which the scrutiny of individual proposals takes place in subject committees of the Scottish Parliament or here. I would gently put down a marker in relation to things as we go forward, that where proposals have a particular locus in the environment or agriculture or fisheries or justice, that I think because it is going to be my individual colleagues who have a responsibility at a policy level, that they will probably be best placed to answer questions, whether here or in other. I'm always happy to come to the committee, as Mr Stewart knows, but I just think as we go forward, and proposals are emanating, from the European Union, but also, as in the case that I've mentioned here, the UK government. All of the examples that Mr Stewart has given example of suboptimal relations is totally avoidable. It is totally avoidable. And I look back since 2021 at the extensive efforts that I have made to try and have good working relationships with colleagues both in London and in Brussels to make sure that there is no reason to fall out about things for any other reason than one has a difference of principle about a particular proposal, as an administrative relations should be good between officials and colleagues in UK government departments and in Brussels, and that those channels are open. I think they are. We await the reset of the UK government and what that means in concrete terms. I think we can be pretty confident that this will involve a proposal around an agriculture, food and drink agreement. I'm very confident that the UK government will wish to make progress on that. I think that raises for us questions for us, because a lot of this is devolved. So how does that work? But in terms of the direction of travel, I'm as certain as I can be that will be something coming down the track. How complex a legislative proposal will that be? We don't know at this stage. And again, in fairness, we can't know because the UK government will still be working out their preferred route of being able to make such an agreement. So I think that's definitely coming. And then we have to have a think about how do we make sure the devolved interests are part of that process. And then we have the other potential areas for agreement with the European Union before getting into what is described as cherry picking, which is unlikely to be welcomed by the European Union. But we know very clearly that the potential to rejoin Erasmus Plus is on the table. We know that the opportunity to rejoin Creative Europe is on the table. And we know, because the Commission proposed it, that there is the opportunity for a mobility agreement, particularly for younger people. And we know how important that would be in general, but in specific areas of the economy or cultural life, how important that would be for creatives and artists, for example, with touring. And that dialogue will continue with the UK government to try and I will be impressing on them, and I would encourage colleagues to be doing likewise to make sure that we can perhaps be inspired by the last Conservative UK government in reaching agreement with the European Union on the Horizon programme, which I was very pleased to see then. And if it was possible to do that with Horizon, I would hope that a UK government could see a way to doing that with Erasmus Plus, doing so with Creative Europe, and doing so with Mobility too.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Thank you again, Cabinet Secretary. And can I also acknowledge the significant progress that's been made by the clerks and the officials in working in getting the data that we need, and thank them both for that work. And as a caveat, because obviously I attend Conveners Group, and I know that in the latter part of a session is when lots of legislation will be coming forward. So just caveat that the capacity to pick up extra bits might be really challenging for us as a parliament in terms of the committee workload. But I just think it's worth putting that on the record too. But thank you, and I'll move to Mr Harvey. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. You mentioned I'll keep this part brief, but you mentioned the sort of negotiating positions in relation to the question of whether a veterinary, a sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, youth mobility, whether there's room for an improved position between the UK and the EU. In our visit to Brussels, I picked up on some views from the EU perspective to the effect that I think one person used the phrase, you'll have to accept every dot and comma of regulatory alignment. And from a UK perspective, I picked up the expectation that, of course, the Europeans will give us what we want because it's in their interest too, really. Would it be your view that the negotiating positions are naturally going to begin at those extremes, and that the potential for something that's agreeable even to a pro-Brexit UK government is simply a matter of political will?
So I mean, firstly, in relation to an agriculture, food and drink agreement, because that will relate to border controls, it will necessitate what is known as dynamic alignment. So the rules will need to be common, which I think is a good thing, and this government does think is a good thing. And having an understanding of that, I think, is important for those who are supporters of Brexit. Mr Kerr, perhaps, he might not welcome such a thing, but this is the difference between a hard Brexit and a less hard Brexit. And I think if you work in an exporting industry, or you work in agriculture, or you operate in the food and drink sector, and we understand how absolutely vital that is to the Scottish economy, indeed is amongst the biggest exports of the United Kingdom, having the access that such an agreement would make to the European single market, because in effect what that then means is that you see a massive reduction in the necessity for border controls. And if you are trying to export shellfish, seafood, anything that is fresh, where time is of the essence, the ability to export quickly is absolutely key. And as we know from a lot of business feedback in Scotland, and I'm sure you heard that in your evidence sessions, there are large parts of the economy which are basically given up on exporting to the single market because of the complications that are now involved. So I think anything that we can do to obviate that that problem should be explored. I mean, there's a much better solution, in my view, which is being in the European single market, and by being a member state in the European Union. That is, what everybody else in the EU thinks is the best thing, and I agree with them. But in the meantime, having an agreement that reduces all of the problems of exporting, sorry, I shouldn't say for the record, not all controls, but significant parts of controls should be welcomed. That there will be different negotiating positions. Of course, there will be different negotiating positions, but these are existing schemes. Erasmus Plus is an existing scheme that we are not a part of. Creative Europe is an existing scheme that we're not a part of. The European single market is a product of treaty agreement between member states. So the idea that a UK government would seek to renegotiate unilaterally all of these areas of agreement between European countries is just not realistic, nor do I think it's particularly sensible. But will there be individual areas where there will be negotiations around things? No doubt. I would also imagine that Mr Harvey and colleagues that were in Brussels were probably hearing a little bit of encouragement from European colleagues to say what the UK actually wants.
More than a little.
And I think we need to be cognizant of that, because I think there is a willingness, there is a wish to have a better relationship with the UK post-Brexit, and there is an opportunity to have arrangements in place. I should say, incidentally, that there are plenty of other countries that have this too. So there's no reason why the UK wouldn't, but it will be the subject of negotiation. But at some point, and this is where I was explaining the process by which there will be discussions between Nick Thomas-Simons and his opposite number, Maros Sefcovic, working towards a meeting in April. I think that's the kind of timescale where it will become more apparent to us all what the UK government's formal position is likely to be in relation to these individual opportunities, Erasmus Plus, Creative Europe, agriculture, food and drink agreement, and mobility. And I think in my mind, there's a sliding scale of likelihood of agreement. So we had the Labour Party, I think, declining the European Commission's proposal for a mobility agreement before the then UK government did, when it was previously made. So I would imagine there's going to be less chance of reaching an agreement on that than there might be on an agriculture, food and drink agreement, with Erasmus Plus and Creative Europe being somewhere in the middle, but I would still be encouraging the UK government to adopt all of these as improvements in our relations with the European Union.
Can I then ask about the Scottish Government's policy of maximum alignment? Obviously, over time, the extent to which alignment can be maximised is not absolute. We're going to see some level of divergence from both sides, including perhaps in some instances matters that are devolved, but many matters that are not devolved, divergence happening on the UK side, and there'll be divergence on the European side as well. You've set out, I think, in your letter 1 and in your comments today 2 key reasons for that policy of maximum alignment. One is to maintain high standards, and the other is to avoid the unnecessary creation of additional non-tariff trade barriers, the kind of issues that we've been discussing in the TCA inquiry. Is there a third objective of that policy which actually becomes more important over time? And again, there'll be some people who disagree with this, but a clear majority in this Parliament and a clear majority in the public recognise that Brexit has been a mistake and support rejoining, whether that's in the context of Scotland or the context of the UK.
Yep.
That might be a long-term objective. It may not happen in this decade. More pessimistically, it might not even happen in the next. But surely the longer there is some degree of divergence, the more value there is in minimising that divergence, in maximising the alignment to the best extent we can, in order that when a process of rejoining becomes politically possible, it's not more complicated than it needs to be.
I totally agree with Mr. Harvey. Because the UK and Scotland as a constituent part of the UK, having been in the European Union since 1973, there has been a massive alignment between policies and legislation between the UK and the European Economic Community at the time, since then the European Union, and we still remain very aligned. Now that the Brexit, the hard Brexit has been foisted upon us, there has been a risk, and this was the position of the last UK government, to try and seek significant divergence, whether one views that as positive or negative. There was a view that this was the rationale of Brexit, to be able to make very different policies, and so there was a sense that was an aim in itself, although the U-turn around retained EU law, I think, proved that wasn't as simple an aspiration as the rhetoric was. But for those of us, and that's the majority of people in Scotland, indeed the UK now, it's shown to be so, would prefer us to be in the European Union, one has to understand the route by which one would do so. And I'm not talking about the politics of, at what stage can we reapply for EU membership, but understanding that when one joins, one does so on the basis of adopting the acquis communautaire, the body of law of the European Union. And if we are as aligned as we are, or not, we have not significantly diverged, it will be significantly easier to rejoin than it will be for other countries that have never been in the European Union and are not aligned at all. So for those of us who support a future for this country in the European Union, alignment is really important. And that is, of course, one of the driving rationale behind alignment. Yes, it's about maintaining the highest standards. Yes, it's about maintaining certainty for business and exporters and so on. And yes, it matters for transparency and democratic oversight, but it is also the route back for this country in rejoining the European Union. And I very much hope that would happen as soon as possible. My preference would be for Scotland to be a member state of the European Union, so it's Scottish ministers in the Council of Ministers, it's a Scottish nominee in the Commission, it's Scottish representation in the European Parliament. All of these would be good things, but I also wish that the UK would be part of the European Union. I think it would be in all of our interests for it to be so, and alignment is a pragmatic approach, but as Mr. Harvey outlines, I think it has the potential prize associated with it of making our membership again of the European Union a much easier prospect than it would for countries that have significantly not aligned with the EU and its legislation. Thank you.
Mr Bibby.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. The Scottish Government obviously has a stated policy of EU alignment, but that does come with important caveats about where is appropriate, and I think those are sensible caveats, but they sometimes get missed or forgotten, I think, in discussion, certainly in the public domain. You've told the committee last year, and again repeated today, about that meaning where possible and meaningful to do so. You've talked about the practical outcomes, reducing burdens, and also welcome what you said about the new UK government looking to take a new approach as well. My question is, though, does the limited use of the keeping pace power, does that reflect a shift in what the Scottish Government has regarded as appropriate since the Continuity Act was passed and that EU alignment policy was set? And do you also reflect that could the Scottish Government have done more to explain those caveats in policy around alignment when considering the gap between the keeping pace power being used and the different regulations that haven't been?
Well, I think those are entirely reasonable questions from Mr Bibby, and he will know, because I've given evidence around this area a number of times to the committee and I just had a look at my introductory statement because I made the point twice in my introductory statement, so I'll say it a third time, that our position is consistently aimed to align its legislation with EU law where possible and meaningful to do so. And that is a caveat that Mr Bibby draws attention to. And there's one particular and significant reason for saying so, is that a large part of European legislation has nothing to do with Scotland at all. So why would we use the time of this Parliament and its committees to introduce legislation that relate to things that don't form part of or have any relation to the Scottish agricultural sector or the Scottish fisheries, or and I could go on. So that is perhaps the biggest area of why there is a caveat in place. Now, I don't rule out that there will be areas that come along where there is a solution that is best suited. It might be a short-term or a medium solution. It may be a longer-term solution, which is different to that has being pursued by the European Union, but it has to be seen in the round, and that is without prejudice to a longer-term decision that would need to be taken on alignment through negotiation at the point of rejoining the European Union. Now, to the second point of Mr Bibby's question in relation to which powers could and should be used to retain alignment, this is where I think we are beginning to better understand that we have a range of ways in which we can remain aligned with the European Union. And if there was an impression that was created for some people that the Continuity Act is the primary and only way in which one can remain aligned, well, that is not correct. Now, of course, it's been used and will be used, but I think it's becoming ever more obvious that there are a wider range of ways in which alignment can be pursued, all of which are subject to oversight by the committee and by Parliament. And I think for parliamentarians it's relatively easy to understand, in exactly the same way as some things require primary legislation, some things require secondary legislation, some things can just be decided on by ministerial direction. There are a range of ways in which that alignment process can be satisfied, and this is where we are in this symbiotic relationship, convener, of making sure that you're satisfied as a committee that we're reporting the process, the rationale why we have pursued alignment using that particular route or another particular route, and for you to get under the rationale to understand whether that is the best way of doing things. And I'm very open to hearing from colleagues on the committee whether you feel that there are more appropriate ways in which we can do things. I was having a conversation with officials beforehand about impending legislation that's coming down the track, where we will have to use the Act for very, very particular legal reasons. And so, to my mind, that makes the point of why you would use the legislation, but for others, it would not be necessary.
Answer. And just my second point, again, do you think the Scottish Government could have done more to explain those caveats in terms of, because I think an impression was created, we're going to align with EU law, and a lot of people were expecting that there would be a lot more alignment from the Scottish Government that there has been. And perhaps those important caveats, which I agree are sensible, it's not criticism, about being possible, meaningful, haven't been articulated as to the public as well as they could have been.
Well, I think if people ever got the impression that the Continuity Act was the sole route by which alignment was going to be pursued, then that has created an impression which doesn't reflect the reality of the situation. I don't think it's so. As I've said before, I mean, I have been back to committee and we have had debates in the Chamber about the Continuity Act and different powers and the different ways that we want. Can we continue to explain that? Yes, we can and we will. As more legislative proposals come forward, because the examples of specific alignment measures is relatively limited at the present time, and these are perhaps on single-use plastics, on wastewater, on a series of issues. These may not all be the issues of highest priority for the public at large, and so perhaps they're better understood by those areas of the economy or society that have a particular interest in environmental standards or food standards or whatever. And I think as we get better used to how we are using the different tools to remain aligned, I think there will be a better understanding that we have a palette of options about how we do that, and we will try and pursue that in the best way, and you will hold us to account as to if that is indeed the best way of doing that. The Continuity Act is not and never was the only way to keep pace with European Union legislation. And if people have had that impression, then I would wish to disabuse them of that, because we have more ways in which we can remain aligned, and we are doing just that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr Kerr.
Well, I should welcome the Cabinet Secretary to the Divergence Club, because in his answer to Neil Bibby, he just made the case for divergence. When something's coming from Brussels or from Strasbourg or from wherever, it isn't in Scotland's best interests. You've indicated a spirit of pragmatism, which I wholly support. Have I heard you correctly?
I would hope that I'm pragmatic, although I'd leave that to other committee members to decide.
On the principle of divergence, you're a pragmatist.
Well, we are pragmatic in that, and I think I don't want to repeat the different stages of the process by which an assessment is made of particular proposals. No, you don't need to do that. I just need to hear that what you said earlier is the government's position. The government's position.
Divergence will be pursued when anything that you've previously signed up to, which you don't know about, the unknown unknowns, when they come our direction, if they're not in Scotland's best interests, the government doesn't join lockstep with that EU directive.
So I'm a glass half full Cabinet Secretary, as Stephen Kerr knows. So my position is that we are trying to remain focused on remaining aligned.
But it's not always possible. It's not always possible, is it?
Well, I was making the point that the biggest single challenge is actually working out which proposals actually have direct relevance for us here in Scotland.
Good point.
So I think, whether it is, and I am making something up here, so whether it's about, I don't know, Greek olives, where we don't need to have a position in Scotland on that, and we are not in the European Union. I will not be making proposals in the Scottish Parliament about Greek olives. I
don't think you need to apologise for being in favour of divergence when it's in the national interest. I think that's very pragmatic. So, can I ask you about that question you've raised about not Greek olives, but the principle? Because in 2023, we know that there were 576 legislative acts and 1,222 directives from the European Union. Can you roughly break down how many of those ended up being not about Greek olives, but things that were pertinent to Scotland? And what is the resource? I mean, you were on the European Scrutiny Committee with Bill Cash. You must have sat through many hours of Bill Cash waxing
more
lyrical.
Than I care to remember,
I'm sure.
Mr. Kerr. Thank you very much.
Waxing lyrical about the issues of unaccountable law coming into this country and fitting into UK law by direction of the European Union. So when you look at the 576 legislative acts and the 1,222 pieces of basically the directives, what's the breakdown? How many actually were pertinent to
so this is, and I know Mr. Kerr is relatively new to the committee, so perhaps he's not read the reports that have been provided to the committee, which we are now doing.
I've got it here, but I haven't added up how many lines there are on these pages and pages of report that have been provided, where there is directives that have come from the European Union that we have not brought forward. There's a column here for future consideration. It goes on and on and on, pages of it. I mean, so I just want to get a sense of how pragmatic you're being about this unending wave upon wave of directives from Brussels.
Well, I mean, this is the process that I described at the beginning of the evidence session, the sift that takes place. Both in Brussels and in Edinburgh. There was previously a sift. I don't remember if Mr. Kerr was ever a member of that committee. It was ably advised by 4 former UK ambassadors, and there was a significant undertaking by the committee. And that has always informed my thinking in relation to this committee, which is why I have been so keen to make sure that we can find the balance in reporting what is being considered from a Scottish Government point of view, with your time and focus on the committee to make sure that you're not having to spend too much time looking at specific proposals around things, especially those that don't have direct relevance. If there is a view in the committee convener that there is not enough information that's been provided to you about things, I would take that very seriously.
That's not.
Because we are working, convener, we are working very hard to make sure that we get that balance right. But if the committee takes a view that you would wish to see more material, I'm happy to take that away and discuss.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out as well that from previous experience in the European Committee, we used to get these to the European Committee in previous sessions when we were part of the EU. And of course, it still has to be sifted through from a Northern Ireland point of view by the UK Government to ensure dynamic alignment in Northern Ireland. Mr. Kerr.
Yeah, no, I'm not asking for more information. I'm making the point about the sifting. I'm making the point about the wave upon wave of directives that come from the European Union that previously, when you were a member of the European Scrutiny Committee, were automatically being admitted into UK law. There was no resistance possible. You had to agree to the directives. We don't have that now. We have the...
Well,
and that's why I'm focusing on your... and I'm applauding this. I hope the Cabinet Secretary will take my compliment that he's being pragmatic as someone who accepts there is a need for divergence. Can I just ask him a broader question, which is about the whole need for us to be in any kind of alignment with the European Union, given the current state of things in Brussels and in Strasbourg? Because there has been a subtle... no, not very subtle change, actually, in the dynamics of European politics, particularly in relation to competition policy. Let me read a quote to the Cabinet Secretary from the President of the French Republic. The EU, he says, could die. We are on the verge of a very important moment. if our former model is over, we are over-regulating and under-investing. He goes on to say, in 2 to 3 years to come, if we follow our classical agenda, which is the regulatory agenda that he's referring to, we will be out of the market. We've got to be very careful about this, haven't we? We're in danger. The European Union is increasingly accepting the Parliament, the composition of the Parliament's changed, the nature of the Commission's remit's changing. There is a direction towards deregulation, isn't there? And shouldn't we be very careful that we aren't swimming in the wrong direction here?
So I would definitely share the view of President Macron that there is a challenge to the European democratic mainstream, which is not what Mr Kerr went on to complete in reflecting Mr Macron's views on the challenge to politics in Europe. And countries like France, increasingly Germany, and one might even say the United Kingdom, is facing an ever-growing challenge from the populist right, which is calling into question our democratic institutions, whether that is as member states, whether that is at a European level, and whether that is multilaterally at a world level. And I think President Macron is right to make sure that all mainstream political parties and voices think about how do we make sure that whether as independent states or as part of wider communities such as the European Union, that we are fit for purpose and that we are making decisions as best we can. The challenge for us in Scotland, of course, is we're not part of it. We're outside. So we can't make these points directly at the Council of Ministers. We don't have a nominee seating in the Commission that is able to,
yes, that's not
to
the point.
make these.
That's
well,
not,
it's my point, Mr.
That's
Kerr.
not the point. That's not the point I'm trying to.
So,
Mr Kerr, can you let the Cabinet Secretary
yes, it's just the answers are very, very long, and I know we've not got very much time.
well, I think the problem for Mr. Kerr is that I disagree with him. I think the problem for Mr. Kerr is I don't agree with him.
Please, can we have order in the committee and let the Cabinet Secretary speak?
I will choose to disagree agreeably with Mr Kerr. We take a different view. Mr Kerr is a Brexiteer. He doesn't believe in the European Union. He doesn't want to be part of the European Union. I don't share that view. I would wish us to be part of it. Should there be a willingness to reform in the European Union, or indeed the United Kingdom, or indeed in Scotland, or indeed in local government? Of course, that is what we do in politics. But I don't call the European Union into question, and I don't call into question our wish to remain aligned. And I pray and aid the fact that not only a majority of people in Scotland, but now across the United Kingdom, regret the Brexit referendum result and would wish to rejoin the European Union.
Thank you. I'm just drawing the Cabinet Secretary's attention to the current flow of opinion among mainstream political leadership in the European Union. I've quoted Emmanuel Macron. There has been a significant report produced by Mario Draghi. I mean, there is a mood in Brussels to deregulate, to free up their economies from the stranglehold of the regulation that they have layered upon layer over the decades. And that's the only point I'm making to the Cabinet Secretary, that we should get into that mainstream as well and understand that economic growth, which I think we all agree on, except we have one or two people in the committee, comes about as you free up the economy and allow it to expand and grow.
That was a statement. There wasn't a question there.
So I was asking if you agreed with that. That was my question.
I answered that in my previous answer, which I think is that all levels of government should be open to reform and to considering how we best make decisions. But the idea that there, uniquely at a European level, that there is legislation and there are different forms of regulation is one of the canards of the pro-Brexit argument that I don't accept. We all need to make sure that we legislate proportionately, that regulation is balanced, because regulation is also about safeguards, and whether it's at a European level, a member state level, a sub-member state level, I think all of us should aim to do just that.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Mr Brown.
Just the one question, Cabinet Secretary, although it's on the same theme that members have been pursuing. So going back into a bit of nostalgia about the times in the House of Commons, if I go back to when I was studying European institutions in the 1980s, and Margaret Thatcher was pushing very hard for greater European integration, economic integration, it was a kind of truism at that time, certainly in academic circles, that there was virtually no effective scrutiny of EU legislation at various forms. Certainly in the House of Commons, notwithstanding the efforts of the committee you mentioned, but such work that was done was really done in the House of Lords. But even that was recognised to be insufficient, given the volume of things coming out of the EU. And that's a big task for the UK government, it's a big task for the Scottish Government. So I'm really pleased to hear you mention things like proportionate. And there's another phrase you used which I can't quite read in your introductory statement, pointing out that you can't do all of this stuff, which is quite right. Given that one of the stated aims of the Scottish Government is, as has been discussed, to make as easy as possible Scotland's opportunities of rejoining the EU, has there been, or is there any scope for being dialogue with the EU, either at Council or Commission level, to find out what it would be important to them in terms of things that Scotland did align with to make as easy as possible? I'm not quite as pessimistic as Patrick Harvey about Scotland's opportunity to re-enter the EU. But the inhibition before was because the UK was a member state, so there was limited conversations between Scotland as Scotland and the EU. That inhibition is no longer there. So is it possible, or is it happening, that that kind of dialogue about what is crucial in order to facilitate the rapid as possible re-entry into the EU?
In my experience of speaking with continental European decision makers, there's tremendous sympathy towards Scotland as a nation that voted to remain in the European Union and having been taken out since that referendum against the will of the majority of the public and the majority in our Parliament. So the default position is a lot of sympathy, and I've heard many people say that were Scotland to wish to accede to the European Union in its own right in a constitutionally agreed process, it would be amongst, if not would be, the quickest ever accession that there has ever been to the European Union, and in significant part because of alignment, but more than that, it is understanding, and not just because of Scotland's important geostrategic or indeed economic position, that Scotland would be a significant contributor to the European Union in the sense of being a good citizen. And as one of the most energy-rich parts of Europe, another reason why European colleagues are very interested in Scotland's participation in a wider European context. This, of course, being something that is now mediated through the UK government. And so we're dependent on decision makers in London understanding why hydrogen interconnectivity between Scotland and the European mainland is actually a priority, understanding why regulatory agreement between the UK and the European Union on energy matters, including hydrogen, should be a priority, but we're still waiting for progress on. So I have not had a single European decision maker say to me, Mr Robertson, we're concerned because Scotland has diverged in this measure or that measure from any European approach to things, full stop. But I think the default position is that there's an understanding that the Scottish Government wishes to remain aligned with the European Union, that we wish to see a path back to European Union membership, and there is a very strong feeling amongst European decision makers, which is basically sympathetic towards Scotland. I should say there's also a very strong feeling that they would wish the United Kingdom to return. But I think there's an awareness that given the politics down south, where both of the major parties in England are now pro-Brexit, that is unlikely to happen in even the medium term. But I have not had any issues flagged to me as being a concern around divergence, because there hasn't been any issue of significant divergence, but the warmth of feeling towards Scotland and a willingness to see Scotland in the EU is I've not heard from a single European decision maker anything that would give me the impression that Scotland would be anything other than very warmly welcomed.
It's not another question, but it's the same question really re-asked, which is that given the burden, and it is a burden, of course it is, on civil servants and having to and this committee and having to try and monitor alignment and NAD alignment, is it not possible, though, to be proactive, to initiate bilateral discussions, disregard what has to go through the UK, and separately Scotland has bilateral discussions about those things which are most important to the EU,
yes,
in order to help relieve the burden on government?
Yeah, well, that's where I would draw colleagues' attention to the prospectus documents that have been published by the Scottish Government during this parliamentary term, including one in relation to the European Union. It was very, very well informed by interlocutors in Brussels about views around a broad range of subjects. And if colleagues haven't, or viewers to this evidence session haven't yet read that particular document, I would recommend them doing so. Will the Scottish Government continue to speak with decision makers in the different European institutions around alignment, around what Scotland is planning to do, about what Europe is planning to do, and making sure that European decision makers understand where the balance of opinion is in Scotland? Yes, absolutely. From my point of view, in relation to the committee, I remain committed to making sure that you receive as much information as you require. If there is a wish that there should be more, we will look sympathetically at that, or presented differently, we will look sympathetically at that, and we're kind of getting towards the end of the first cycle of reporting to the committee, so we will no doubt have lessons to learn, but I think we are heading in the right direction. Going back to Mr. Brown's point about scrutiny and how it has operated elsewhere, I think there is a challenge. I alluded to it earlier on in the evidence session, convener, about things relating to Europe being seen by some colleagues as something that happens over there in the European Scrutiny Committee, in the case of the House of Commons, as was, or indeed this committee in the Scottish Parliament. We need to understand that things relating to Europe have, whether we like it or not, whether aligned or not, has a relevance for our different committees and for us as different parliamentarians in different parties. That is true for all of us, and I'm hoping that this reporting mechanism that we have can serve this committee well, but can also serve parliamentarians more broadly in understanding where things actually are.
Mr. Adam, very quickly,
Good
please.
morning.
Mr. Adam, we're really short of time, but if you could be succinct, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, I'm always sharp and to the point, as I just preamble there. But basically, Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned earlier on about the veterinary agreement, and you quite rightly said you've seen it as an agriculture, food and drink agreement, because in our trip in Brussels, these are key issues for us. Now, my question, to succinctly put it, is are we doing enough to align, to ensure, because as Patrick Harvey said, every comma was mentioned that we'd have to pass, and particularly in these sectors, for all the reasons you mentioned earlier on, are we aligning enough to make sure that we can get ourselves into a position where we can negotiate, where we can actually get these key sectors to trade in Europe? And do we need to do any more? And if we do, what is it?
I'm not aware of anything that would require significant change. I do think that we will need to have clarity. I don't think this is a contentious point. We will need clarity from the UK government on the mechanism, the legislative mechanism, the form of the legislation, how we as a government and as a parliament can feed into that process of legislation that would then lead to an agriculture, food and drink agreement between the UK and the European Union. We are having a very open dialogue. I'm in London next week. I will be raising this with the UK government then. I'll be raising sitting at an interministerial meeting with the UK government in December. We want to work with the UK government. I think this is a shared priority for most parties and most members of the Scottish Parliament, and certainly is for the government. And I think where there is a will, there is a way, and I think it will be hugely beneficial to the Scottish economy, which has suffered because of Brexit, to the agriculture sector, which has suffered because of Brexit, which will be good for our food and drink sector, which has suffered because of Brexit. And I think this would be a development that we can all play an active part in seeing delivered during this parliamentary term, both this Scottish parliamentary term, but the current UK parliamentary term as well.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and to your officials for attending. It's been really interesting, and I think it's laying out some of the challenges around keeping pace when the pacemaker is not in your team, setting the pace and the direction of travel. So thank you very much for your attendance this morning. On that, I'm going to close the committee meeting today, and